Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of the ORF series titled Neighborhood Scope. Today we are, of course, going to discuss Afghanistan. Uh, I think it's very clear from the Indian point of view that, and something which has been stated by the government of India as well, that while the rest of the world, um, especially the Western world, can afford to forget about Afghanistan, turn their backs on what happens in Afghanistan, India is not in a position to do something like that. And at ORF, we continue to monitor what is happening in Afghanistan and try and make sense of what is happening. So, this edition of Neighborhood Scope is, of course, going to be centered around what is happening in Afghanistan. We have a very fine panel with us today. We have Bilkis Daud, who's an assistant professor at the OP Jindal University. We have Sara Wahidi, who is an entrepreneur and has a web app titled Sivam. She is the CEO of that. And of course, a very robust presence on social media, raising the state of affairs in Afghanistan very regularly. We have Betty Dam, who is a journalist, investigative journalist, and who has written what is a very counterintuitive book on the Taliban. Some would say a very provocative book, but a very, very interesting book. So it's great to have her on the panel. And of course, we'll be joined by Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, who's the former Indian ambassador to Afghanistan. And although he's not here, I must say that he has a knack of being posted in the hottest of hotspots around the world. So he served as India's ambassador in Syria, in Afghanistan, and Myanmar. So you can make of it what you will. None of those problems in those countries are because of him, but he has served there. So let me just start today's session by posing my first question to Sara. Sara, before the Taliban came to power, there were a lot of voices in the West. Not many of us bought those voices, but there were these voices in the West that the Taliban 2.0 is different from Taliban 1.0, that the kind of repression that was witnessed during 96 to 2001 when the Taliban captured power will not be repeated. The Taliban have learned their lessons. They will walk step in step with the rest of the world. Their attitude towards women and women's education, towards minorities will change. But over the last almost 4 years now, what we have seen is that things are getting from bad to worse. In terms of the edicts that are being issued, we are seeing things slide back to what they were in the 1990s. So my question to you is, how are you looking at the current state of a want of a better word, repression that seems to be underway inside Afghanistan? Sara.
Thank you so much, everyone at ORF. Thank you so much, everyone at ORF. I was with you last year at Raisina Dialogue, and I really hope that I'm able to return. I very much love India. And before I start my preface, because I want to thank you all for having me today, the first time I visited India in 2018, I was at the Kabul visa office, and I was having the interview to be able to enter India. And I told the interviewer about the fact that I had never been to India, and he said, how can you do this? Like, there's really no border between Afghanistan and India, and we have such a shared culture. And he gave me this 1-year visa, and he said, even though you're only going for 3 days, I want you to really enjoy India, and I want you to see India. And I preface that because we do have an incredibly shared culture and experience, and I hope that through this conversation we can talk about India's integral stance and positionality in terms of Afghanistan. But in terms of the current state of affairs, we're seeing a lot of splintering and factions that are starting to unravel that are quite unprecedented in the last 3 years. What's different between the first regime and this regime is that there's more eyes on this regime and the Taliban. But what has stayed and what has been relentless and what many of us from the very beginning had been sounding the alarm is that there really won't be much of a difference in terms of this regime compared to the first one. We're seeing the codification. If you look at the first list of decrees in the Taliban from 1996 onwards, a lot of those decrees have been quite staunch and entrenched, and we're seeing a lot of those the codification of those laws and decrees from 1996. And what's different is, and I've said this many times, is the Taliban was very much aware of the fact that globalization and the eyes of the world on Afghanistan has changed the way that they would be able to implement these edicts, which meant that there would be a very slow reintegration of these decrees. And that's exactly what had happened. When we were saying that schools would shut down, when we were saying that women would eventually be pushed away from the public sphere, that was what we were saying in 2021. And because it was in such a methodological phased approach, a lot of the international world wasn't able to respond in the robust manner that perhaps we would have seen if it was a blanket decree or edict that essentially aimed to erase women from the public sphere. And because of that, the world in that, in the media cycle and the exhaustive aspect of it, forgot Afghanistan and Afghan women and girls in that. So in terms of the Taliban, there are many factions, and we're seeing those come out, especially with a couple of high-profile leaders heading to the UAE under the preface of medical concerns, but we're seeing a 1-week trip turn into a couple of months. And obviously, Akhundzada, the leader in Kandahar, essentially being the center focus, but perhaps that things are not as cohesive as many of us had thought. For me, the Taliban, it was quite difficult, especially being on the side of an opposing position, to really understand the internal thought processes. And I'm sure Bette will be able to provide more information on that. But in terms of the way that we've seen them externally, there was essentially this notion that they had come together, especially in terms of those who come from Pakistan or those who had been in Afghanistan for quite some time, in terms of the leadership. But the notion and the question of women's education has really been, I think, a splintering effect for them. And obviously, at the helm of the ICC, notion the announcement of the arrest warrants as well. Perhaps, as some intellectuals here at Oxford have said, perhaps that could have also been one of the reasons why we're seeing a more vocal, perhaps, disagreement with the supreme leader. So there's an unraveling that's happening. To what extent that unraveling will continue to occur is something that we'll have to watch in the ongoing months.
Betty, if I can turn to you, Sarah just spoken about what seems to be the internal feuds in the Taliban movement, which seem to be emerging. I don't know if they have reached that tipping point where it descends into some kind of internecine warfare between these various factions. But what is your sense of the state of cohesiveness within the Taliban movement? Do you think that these disagreements, some of which are being aired very publicly, efforts are being made to paper them over, they are actually a lot more serious than what one would imagine? Or do you think this is more of a storm in the teacup insofar as the Taliban movement is concerned? Betty Dam.
Yeah, good morning from New York. It's early here. So I try to be sharp. I think indeed the question about divisions inside what I still call a movement, I think they want to really be seen as the Islamic Emirate, as a functioning government. But it is not, it is in a way it is not a cohesive group. I think it's also a question that the outsiders ask me often as the first question. It's also a question I think that shows hope that it will fall apart, and for that there is a new opportunity for something better. I think there is definitely disagreement between each other. I think many people overlook. The other question that I'm asked most is the Taliban 2.0. I think there's a whole different movement than there was in the 90s. I think the decrees are the same, but the people who work with the decrees are different. The disagreement within the movement is also because the setup of Mr. Akhundzada as the leader is a very different one than with Mullah Omar. Mullah Omar came from a different tribe, actually, in Kandahar, from a competing tribe. Akhundzada is from the Nurzai, is a whole different dynamic. It's a lot of businessmen. He surrounds himself by his own tribe. He is so afraid that he has a militia of at least 300 men, personal men around him that protect him. He at the same time he is very disconnected from the tribe and the men and the family of Mullah Omar. Yaqub is in Kabul, is a little bit on the sideline. The Haqqanis on the same are also a little bit in their own group. I think we missed a large opportunity after the fall. The Taliban came to Afghanistan. They also felt quite unprepared for this, and the men like Yaqub, for example, or others, have been raised in Pakistan, where their situation and the surroundings are also influenced by modernism. Quetta is a big city. Karachi is a metropole. Meeting these men, their kids, they speak fluent English. Have been exposed to a different world, including education, girls' education. We did see after the fall that they were trying to get their act together. For example, the fact that Tolo News, that has been over the 20 years extremely exclusive, excluding the Taliban in their coverage, plus also very much an Afghan government line of thinking. The Tolo News stayed open was incredible. That the women were presenting the news was incredible from somebody who has followed the Taliban for 5 years and written the book on Mullah Omar. Those were for me great opportunities that I was like, oh, maybe we will get something new. We will have another chance here. I have also met the ambassadors on the Western side in Islamabad talking about these 7 months and about their attitude. Also, I've talked to the editors of American media talking about their tone in their coverage. And so while we had a group of men coming from different backgrounds, even the Emir has been exposed in Quetta in Islamabad to the world that is offered by Pakistan, which has indeed much more diversity, more girls' education, is not that conservative as we know the situation in Uruzgan or Kandahar. All these diverse thinkers came back to Afghanistan with the backgrounds in 2024. And what is now established is that the West did not give that sort of air that such a new movement needed. We, as a press, but also as a Western government, were from the beginning extremely harsh, and we expected and reported, and also in the statements of the EU or the statements of the United States government, were already clear that the Taliban would be a disaster. So we were very judgmental in that. And we said, okay, yeah, the television station is open. We have female presenting on the television, but this will stop tomorrow. And yes, indeed, after some time, it stopped. And I think there is a dynamic that has not been positive for Afghanistan. And that sort of made the core of this movement that sits in Kandahar more and more and more conservative. But I think if I would need to write a headline tomorrow about girls' education in Afghanistan, you could also write a headline that around 85% of the Taliban is pro-girls' education. It has become a very close-knitted group in Kandahar who play the game of Mullah Omar, who did not want to speak to the outside world for reasons that fit his personality. The Emir was meeting lots of people in Quetta, was going around, went to the hospital in Islamabad, was not so seclusive, but is playing the game now to do exactly that, in the hope that he will be seen as somebody unapproachable, somebody very strong, somebody who can micromanage everything. And we let that happen. As journalists, for example, we don't settle ourselves in what is actually the capital of Kandahar right now. If you look at the power balance, that is Kandahar, it's not Kabul. So the elite that flies to Kabul to cover or to do aid work do not settle themselves for a couple of months to really understand that city and to understand the tribal conflicts that are present and that can help you understand the Emir. I think that is really important because we are all talking from the outside, but we don't have the interest and the curiosity to gather the knowledge that needs to happen to understand the situation better. That's
an interesting take on what is happening, but I think some of the responsibility for putting the systems in place so that the Taliban acceptability to the rest of the world would increase would also lie upon the Taliban themselves. Uh, I don't see how it is possible to say that, look, this is the way these guys were, that you should give them time to adjust. Because a lot of what they promised to the rest of the world at the time when negotiations were going on, both in the front and the back channels, was that assurances were being held forth on how they would treat women, how they would treat minorities. And clearly, whatever their compulsions are, they seem to have reneged on them. So I think there is certainly a lot of responsibility which falls upon the Taliban system as well. But Bilkis, if I might turn to you now, uh, you know, the fact of the matter remains that we've now seen that, and now we are learning that the Americans, at least for the last 3 or 4 years, were giving hundreds of millions of dollars to the Taliban for whatever reason, whatever convoluted logic there was in giving this kind of money. That seems to have stopped. We've seen that in the West, particularly, and many other countries, in fact, internationally, while there is a level of engagement with the Taliban, at the same time, nobody is ready to really, you know, recognize the Taliban or move forward with them, in a sense, to have very normal relations with them. And now we've seen that the aid is being cut. How does the Taliban regime survive if those hundreds of millions of dollars are not coming in? How do the people survive? I'm sure you have family out there. It's not a normal economy in the way we understand normal economies. Uh, how are people surviving?
Well, thank you. Exactly as you said, that after Taliban's take over, the only sector that has seen as a bright spot was economy, because the currency is stabilized thanks to the millions of dollars that were shipped to Afghanistan, and there was a growth in the economy, 2.7% after the shock of withdrawal, and there's a decline in the level of corruption, but it hasn't really gone totally, and because the perpetrator of violence are in power, so now trade has been much easier, though there are also many sides of it. So how ordinary people are surviving with the fact that 50% of population were women, they are totally erased from the public life. It's very difficult for ordinary people to survive. But the only thing that is that because the conflict has ceased or has decreased in the rural areas, and mostly people are relying on agriculture now. The other thing is that many families, like including my family, who are living in Afghanistan.
So what's happening in the urban areas then?
Yes, in urban areas, mostly people are relying on remuneration from abroad. If they have families abroad, then the money is coming to them. And though it's very difficult because government jobs are very handful, education sector and health sectors are totally, outsourced to NGOs. So people who are working there, they are getting salaries from their donor agencies. So these are the things that people are surviving on a daily basis. But of course, things are not that easy, and whoever has the opportunity to leave the country, they are leaving. Though those opportunities are also very limited, considering the fact that there are no missions, or there are very limited missions, foreign missions in Afghanistan, and providing visa for Afghans are not that easy. But recently Taliban also, they have decreased government official salaries. But the thing is, in one hand, economies, doing better. But on the other hand, there are no credible sources that how Taliban are spending the revenues of the government. And though in one side there has been, sources that the level of conflict has decreased, it's because the perpetrator of violence are in power. But on the other hand, Taliban are spending 40% of government revenue on security. And so these things are there, and still in urban settings, the crimes are really, happening. So many people who don't really have a regular income, there are also petty crimes that are happening in the country. So things are not really good, because remember that in Afghanistan, because of the long years of conflict, many households are headed by women. Single mothers or single women who are headed households, and women have no opportunities to work outside. Recently, even with the ban on a midwife and healthcare centers, so for ordinary Afghans, it's very difficult to survive in these circumstances. And now with the Trump in power and even more, cutting aid, there will be lots of pressure on Taliban, and they might find new ways to, deal with the current situation.
You said something about people are getting money from their relatives abroad, but I believe all banking channels are already shut. So how are the money coming in? Is it the traditional Hawala Hundi channels?
Yes, because in Afghanistan, networks plays a very important role. So we usually use our traditional way of, sending money, hawala. We call it hawala. So that really plays a role. And also, though there has been, clashes on the border with Pakistan, but still movement of people never stops on the Durand line, right? Because they're the same people who are living on the both sides of the line. So they are usually relatives, neighbors, friends that send money from neighboring countries also. So these traditional sources always work in Afghanistan.
You had said something about the various factions which are at play in Afghanistan. You were talking about the kind of tribal linkages of the Amirul Mumineen, the self-styled Amirul Mumineen Haibatullah. Do we have any idea of who are exactly the people who are advising him, what their backgrounds are? Are these businessmen? Are these drug lords? Are these clerics? Are these warlords? And then what is their relationship with some of the other groups? Because, it's dumbed down to say that it's Kandahar versus Kabul, but within the Kandahar lot of Taliban, there are people who don't necessarily agree with the Emir. They have their differences with him. And within the Kabul hierarchy, there are also people who are ready to repudiate some of their own people to make common cause with the Emir. So, do you have some idea on what these various factions are? Who are the advisors of the Emir, and how this dynamic is playing out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am. Yeah, I think I'm happy to answer. I was just a little bit taken aback by your response to my explanation of the situation, which I try to make a balanced situation where there is Taliban responsibility, but there is also American government responsibility. There's a media responsibility. You have to always see it in a sort of bigger picture. I'm not here to Taliban bash. I'm here as a professor, as an author, and to try to explain the different dynamics. That is very important to if you really want to understand the situation. That as a first note. On the advisorship of the Amir, there are not many. There are not many. The Amir, I think also for security reasons, doesn't see many people. There's a possibility to leave a letter, and many letters are delivered at the compound, though many in Kandahar don't know where he is. He does travel. We hear sometimes that he is on a plane to Herat, for example. I was in Kandahar, and he was visiting a mosque. So he does go around, I think, but that is like 1.5 years ago. And I think it is less and less. I think he is very afraid of his security. You've seen the attack on Mullah Brother, the very good friend of Mullah Omar, who is in the clique of Mullah Yaqub and the Kandahari Hotak. Yeah, the sort of constellation that was around Mullah Omar. We see with him, the Nurzai, indeed, it's good that you mentioned the businessmen. I think they play an enormous role. They have always played an enormous role. Also in the 90s, there would have been no Taliban if there would have been no support of the businessmen, like big men like Haji Bashar, for example, who was basically the person who put Mullah Omar on the stage. The Nurzai is a tribe that owns the transport along the road that goes from Quetta into Kandahar, and then the road goes to the stands on the countries on the left side, and of course to Iran. But there's at the same time as a lot of these businessmen claim that they have met the Amir. It's now a sort of game. Like, have you met him? Have you met him? You know, like because he doesn't see anybody or like hardly anybody. So it's difficult to check if that has actually happened. But around him, there are like 3 advisors, 3, 4. That's the analysis. Who are with him, who are from the same tribe, who are into justice, and they are older men. They were also active in Mullah Omar's movement, and they are basically back and are extremely conservative. I at least that's what they show with their girls' education plan. They really, yeah. I mean, if you travel through the South, even in 2005 or 2015. But also in other areas in the north, you know, there was always a sort of traditional tribal rule of not sending your girls to school because it could harm the honor of the family. And so there's not an automatic enormous amount of girls that went to school in these villages, also under the Americans. But what is really painful for the Kandaharis and for everybody, I think, in Afghanistan, it was exactly the same under Mullah Omar, is that the choice has been taken away. They want to have the freedom to send the girls to school or not. They want to have the freedom to dress how they want to dress. They want to have the freedom to go to the mosque or not. Many in Afghanistan will go to the mosque anyway, but they don't want to be forced. And that is, that is also in Kandahar the case. I hope this is a helpful picture.
Just as a follow-up, is there some metric on the basis of which we can measure whether the steps being taken by the Emir are popular within the movement, are acceptable, even though we know that there is opposition to him, they are acceptable, which means that he can take these very conservative orthodox steps and get away with it, that there will be no pushback. Uh, do we have any idea of what kind of popularity or what kind of support or even what kind of firepower he commands? Do we have any idea of that?
Yeah, I think the pushback is really big. There's a lot of people, including businessmen, who fly to Kandahar to bring it up, especially the girls' education and the effects of it, like the lack of female doctors, for example, is very dangerous. And yeah, that is indeed there's pushback. Do we hear? I mean, it's not that we have large demonstrations or we don't see that in Kandahar, for example. Even under Mullah Omar, we didn't see that sort of gatherings, but there's a lot of outreach among each other. At the same time, it's also been 20 years of really insecure situation for many people. That still has an effect of like, well, this is better than constantly having the drones on top of your head, including troops running through your street unannounced without too much information, killing left and right the wrong people. It was really, really, really bad war. It killed a lot of innocent people. Many have been communicated as a sort of civilian casualties, and there were many more civilian casualties than we thought. So yeah, that plays a role as well. But I think Sarah jump in as well, because I don't know how often you go to Afghanistan, how how the situation is according to you, how the unrest is organized, and the unhappiness with this. But yeah, I don't think we will see these big demonstrations. I think it will be in other forms. And what I see now is that a lot of leaders fly to Kandahar, wait there for weeks to see him, to bring it up, to see the mayor of Kandahar, who is very close to the Emir, to see his justice minister, who is very close to the Emir, to talk, and it's going nowhere. It's going absolutely nowhere. It's going the opposite side. So he's also playing a game. He is risking a lot of support in Afghanistan, and I am frustrated not to be able to answer you like why. And I think it's the most important question. Any journalist from now going to Afghanistan, you have to answer this question. Otherwise, we talk to each other in Doha, we talk to each other in Dubai or in Oxford or here in New York, and we don't have the fundamental knowledge. The World Bank doesn't have it. The American ambassador doesn't have it. Yeah, so, and we do not try hard enough, I think.
Yeah, I think you have a point out there. People don't try hard enough. I think there are a lot of people who are losing interest, a lot of people who stopped caring, and a lot of people who think it's not worth it. Unfortunate, but that just seems to be the way it is. But Sarah, we are hearing of some stirrings of resistance continuing. There are conflicting reports. Some say that, look, this resistance is not worth the paper it's written on. Most of these guys are discredited people. They are living in comfort in Turkey and in Uzbekistan and in Tajikistan. They make a lot of song and dance about it, but there are very few people on the ground actually trying to do something to resist the Taliban. There are others who say that, well, these people are gathering strength. They are starting to get support from different countries, including, if the Pakistani media is to be blamed, the Pakistanis have now decided that the the NRF and the other forces which are resisting now deserve Pakistani help so that they can continue doing what they've been doing for the last 40 years. Uh, what is your assessment of the resistance from the anti-Taliban forces? And what is your assessment about the possibility of the pushback, which we were speaking about earlier, within the Taliban actually leading to some kind of reform within the Taliban movement?
Thank you, Sushant. It's quite heartbreaking to say this, and I say it probably more comfortably than I would say with an Afghan audience, but I don't see this regime going anywhere. There are some alliances that have gone together recently. Yesterday was the Herat Security Dialogue, which a lot of the infamous Afghan politicians had gone to Spain. Last week was the Vienna conference where Ahmad Shah Massoud's son, Ahmad Massoud, was leading that roundtable with many of the high-profile leaders like Fawzia Koofi, who is a ex-parliamentarian. So there are these groups who are gathering and discussing. I don't see that those discussions in terms of actual boots on the ground and actual resistance will lead somewhere. There's definitely, and what's become clear is a larger diaspora thought process compared to what's happening in Afghanistan. And like Betta had said, I mean, for me, my work is very much situated in Afghanistan. I work on covert technology in Afghanistan, and I work primarily with women. And it's very much how Betty said, it's about choice. The choice to go to school, the choice to to be able to go out to a certain place, the choice to be able to take a taxi from one place to another without having to drag your father or your brother with you. Or perhaps in many contexts, like Professor Daoud had said, a lot of places, women are having to make these social movements on their own, and they're not able to have someone, a mahram, to be with them. So this removal of a lot of these foundational decision making that women used to make are gone. And so in terms of resistance, I know that ways women resist on a daily basis, and a lot of the ways that they resist is just perhaps lying to the Taliban. So for example, if they're trying to get to a cafe to see a friend, they'll say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to the hospital. I don't have someone with me today." And they're learning to maneuver. So one of my dearest friends who was in Afghanistan up until a few months ago, she recently sought asylum in France. Told me that, I said, how do you maneuver? And she said, I would meet a Talib and I would say, "Oh, I apologize. I'm gonna go get some groceries and I'm gonna go home, and I didn't have my dad with me to sit in the car." So these are the ways that women are resisting in a daily basis. And if you ask them in terms of a wider resistance, it's to exist, and it's to continue to do the work that they did and to live the lives that they did as best they can. The erasure of school, I mean, that one has, I think it's the one that I care about the most. And as a technologist, I'm not a politician, and I'm not the kind of individual who cares about power brokerages. But for me, it's education. For me, that for Afghan women and girls who've reached out to me, it is, I want to go to school, and I want that school to lead somewhere. I don't want to just be in a madrasa and not have the foundational teachings to learn science and STEM. Especially, a lot of women are very much more interested in STEM, engineering, architecture, healthcare. A lot of these rulings in terms of healthcare just are incredibly egregious and just don't make any sense, because a lot of the closures have impacted NGOs that work in very small villages where there's not a lot of movement for women, and actually a lot of the doctors and nurses are women. So these kinds of impulsive decision making and that we're seeing, and I'm glad that we're getting this perspective on what's happening internally in all these different factions, because I think that what we're taking out from this conversation is that we really haven't done a very good job at understanding the actual thought process of the Taliban and the decision making on all these different tribes and these different groups. And that has been perhaps one of the biggest mistakes that we've made as an international community, is not really trying to understand how they work. Of course, I vehemently disagree with their decrees, especially seeing the women and girls that I work with and how much it's impacted them. But we're not going to be able to find a solution until we really understand the premise behind the decision making. It could actually be the fact that Kandahar has now become the central focus, and the way that these businessmen are making these deals, and especially in terms of development and infrastructure. And now we're seeing Azizi Group, who've just announced that they're going to be investing $10 billion. And this is an unprecedented level of private partnership that circumvents and goes around the World Bank, that goes around the IFC. And this is going to probably continue, because if Azizi Group is actually able to do this and is actually able to implement a $10 billion project, perhaps there are other businessmen who will actually invest and say, we don't need the IFC, we don't need the World Bank, we don't need these agencies. And what does that do in terms of Afghanistan and the leadership? But in terms of resistance, I've seen how the Iranian regime has been able to circumvent a lot of sanctions, and their country continues to thrive. They also have per capita the most female engineers in the world. So there are all these different types of realities to consider, but I don't see currently the resistance that have been popping up and that we're seeing a lot more on social media. I don't really see them going anywhere right now. It's really a couple of foundational issues that Afghans in Afghanistan are having, and that is education, and obviously access to these services that they've had for the last 20 years in terms of humanitarian agencies. But we also know that the Afghan currency is one of the strongest currencies in the world. So there are so many complexities, and we can no longer just say, we believe in women's rights and we believe in this, and just kind of lead our policy in that stance. There's a lot of complexity that's happening right now, and I hope that what we move forward to now is bridging those gaps of trying to make sense of an extremely complex situation. I'm one of those people who are just at a dead end, because I very much want to see Afghan women and girls return to school. I very much want them to be able to return to being able to take agency over their lives, because even in the 20 years of the two regimes of power, the US-backed governments, we saw central Kabul, a couple of cities that were able to provide maybe education, but about 30 provinces that were left in isolation from 2001 onwards, regardless. So it's not a happy response, but I would say that dialogues are happening within the diaspora, but what will that lead to in terms of on the ground? I mean, also my job for 8 years was to monitor security incidences on a daily basis. And I will tell you that some of in the Pakistani media, they're talking about, this increase in skirmishes, in explosions. They're really not that impactful. I mean, the level of skirmishes, explosions, IEDs that we saw, especially between 2016 to 2021, is incomparable. There are obviously some NRF or the Northern Alliance who have been announcing that or the Afghan National Front, who've announced some IEDs or some targets, but to the extent of what that will do to impact, I'm not sure. And even if they've been targeting high-profile officials, a couple of them in the last 6 months, whether that will lead to some sort of splintering in terms of the Haibatullah factions, I don't think so. So the resistance really, in terms of dialogue, perhaps we're seeing more of them, but in terms of actual impact on the ground, I don't know if that will really lead to anything in the foreseeable future. I hate to say it, but yeah.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you think one of the problems of the inability to mount any kind of solid resistance on the ground to the Taliban is the fact that most of that there is no new leadership that the people who want to resist the Taliban can rally around? And the old leadership is so discredited. The way they ran away, the kind of lives they are living, whether it is Ahmed Masood or anybody else, I don't see what is their credibility among the people. His father was a different cup of tea, but the young guy, I don't know why anybody would want to take him seriously. So isn't there a huge that there is nobody no person or no organization around which people can actually rally around. Isn't that a big problem as well?
That's a really great question, Sushant. I think about this in terms of clientelistic cleavages. I think about this in terms of who has actually been able to help Afghans in the last 20 years. And if you look outside in terms of the rural areas, you're thinking of a life where, you're not having access to water in your well, or you're observing fighting between the Afghan army and the Taliban, and you're essentially watching schools be used as bases for fighting between these two groups. So essentially, a lot of the I think the mistake that has been made in terms of understanding support by Afghans in Afghanistan is who has been able to provide those clientelistic cleavages. If I need security, if I need healthcare, if I need aid, sometimes it could be an aid agency, sometimes it could have been the Taliban, sometimes it could have been individuals for the last 20 years that we weren't able to, like you said, have those metrics of understanding the level of support in terms of the rural areas. And I'm really trying very hard recently to focus on the rural areas, because I have been one of those individuals who's focused a lot on the data and the metrics that we have, and unfortunately that's been in the 5 main larger provinces, and that has been a mistake, because you really don't understand the true scope. But I think that on the ground, there's just been an incredible distortion of not understanding what really is the support like on the ground. And even for myself, I mean, if I were to live in Afghanistan, and I think if you asked anyone, and I've asked a couple of women who I work with, is that, these conversations are happening outside of the country. And Ashraf Ghani, a little bit Hamid Karzai, and a lot of the MPs have returned after the Bonn conference. I mean, these are individuals who, like you said, had left Afghanistan. And I think what Afghans have learned from the previous regime is that those technocrats came and left. As soon as August 15th happened, most of the technocrats escaped on the first couple of days in Kabul airport. And Afghans watched that. They saw that, and they saw the fact that their leaders, regardless of the concern for their safety, some stayed and they were arrested for a couple of days, but then eventually they were released, or now they've eventually fled. But what that says is that whatever civil resistance comes, has to come from an individual who has lived with the Taliban, who has engaged with the Taliban, and who knows how they work. Whether that civil resistance exists is now a question of the future. I don't think that there is a civil resistance in terms of Afghans who really vehemently believe that what the Taliban is doing requires a full civil war. I don't think so at all. Like we talked about, a lot of the issues are in terms of the foundational access points to education, to, like if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the foundational thing for Afghans was security. It was a complete exhaustion of instability, and they've provided that. When you provide such a necessary need, which is your security, it's going to be very difficult to say, well, now we want you to be a leader that strives on democratic values. And, this is a complete, misnomer in terms of this conversation. The Taliban, essentially, if you look just at the statistics, we have seen a stark decrease in instability in terms of warfare. So that will provide and solidify power for the Taliban for some time. What now needs to happen is support of civil leaders. Unfortunately, we had Matiullah Waisa, who was an amazing education activist, who was detained for, I forget how long it was, but I think it was like 6 to 8 months. Who essentially provided or fought for the cause of girls' education and children's education. And so those civil leaders need to be supported in a manner that says, we're not interested in terms of political factions. We're interested in fighting for these fundamental rights like education. And the strategic aspect should be for a lot of, for example, if the Indian government is engaging with the Taliban, is to really speak on those pinpoints, is, like Betty said, if 85% of the Taliban is very much in Kandahar, is against the education ban, those are the types of linkages that need to be approached in terms of why this education ban is happening, what is the impetus behind this, and how can it be, approached, and less more about perhaps supporting resistance. Because I don't think if you did a survey in terms of leadership, not in terms of the policy of education, I think in terms of leadership, people would say we're happy with the security and perhaps the security that we have now, and what needs to be discussed is the decrees and the edicts. So that's a long-winded way of saying that, the resistance in terms of boots on the ground, I don't think that that's something that requires a lot of robust conversation, because I just don't think that it's there.
Say something before I come to Ambassador, because I have a lot of questions for you, but I'll come to that.
Actually, I have 3 comments on 3 different points. But the first one, I couldn't agree more with Sarah, exactly about the resistance that we are talking about. It's also lack of leadership, as you said, but it's also that, in Afghanistan, just remember that we have been, suffering from war for 45 years now, right? So people are really, really tired of going back to the periods of civil war. So that's why the kind of resistance that people are going to, support is exactly as Sarah said, that if it's some kind of resistance from a very grassroots level, not the kind of dialogue that we are having in diasporas, because just remember that the 20 years of intervention that, of course, brought lots of changes to the lives of Afghans and also to the lives of women, but it also strengthened or equipped only few figures. And sometimes people are also tired of those figures to be seen in the politics of Afghanistan, because the level of corruption was very high. So unless we have the pin pad organization, as Sarah was talking about, the Matiullah Wase was providing, for example, mobile libraries, girls' education, and not only to the urban centers, but to the very rural center, to the south, to Elman, to Uruzgan. So that kind of things, if they come up in a grassroots level, then I think people will support that, but not the kind of resistance that we could see in terms of, the Northern Alliance. And another point that I had was about I think in the beginning you mentioned that the Taliban are having responsibility of delivering or, kind of supporting or respecting women's rights, if correct me if I'm wrong. But, which kind of responsibility are we talking about? Because if you see the nature of the Doha peace deal, peace deal did not put any kind of responsibility on Taliban, because the deal was exactly between the Americans and Taliban, right? And even in the deal, if you see, there was no mention of Afghanistan constitution, democracy, and women's rights. So these things were not even respected and mentioned by the international community, because the nature of the deal was as such that Americans wanted to leave Afghanistan. And the thing was that they told Taliban that, let us go and don't kill us. That's why airport was in the hand of Americans till the end, right? That was the last place that was, taken over by Taliban. So women's rights were not mentioned in Doha peace deal. So Taliban, they said that we don't have any responsibilities because we have won the war. And, Americans gave Afghanistan in a platter to them. The other point that I had about girls' education, girls' education in traditional Afghan society before Taliban is not so simple, right? For example, I have seen so many comments that traditionally people in rural Afghanistan, they are not in favor of girls' education, especially in South and Southeast that are mostly populated by Pashtuns, right? So it's not so simple. I come from Southeast of Afghanistan. I'm from Paktika. And I'm educated, right? So my family always allowed me to get education, though I have been born and brought up in Afghanistan, so my case will be a little bit different. But see, in Afghanistan, situation of Afghanistan is very, very complicated, especially in the villages. For example, in my village, in Paktika, in Srauza, if you see, there aren't any family who will be against girls' education. But of course, girls' education should be safe and secure for them. right? And for example, in the 20 years of intervention, lots of NGOs, they provided education facilities. But even the schools that were built, they were much far from their homes. Like girls, they have to cross miles, they had to walk, they had to cross roads to go to the to schools. So of course, families did not feel secure to send their girls to that far schools. And at the same time, the number of female teachers were very less. So traditionally, Afghans, they didn't want their daughters to be taught by male teachers, right? But the idea that Afghanistan has always been so conservative and against girls' education is not really correct, right? Afghanistan has always been a traditional society, but not conservative that the way that you see it today. And this level of radicalization, extremism, that has really changed Afghanistan, and that has been there from the time of jihad, when the Soviet occupation took place, and when the people declared jihad against Soviets. That is the time that the different interpretation of Islamic values kind of changed the lifestyle of women in the villages, people in the villages. For example, my family, they come from the village, and they would always say that in the villages, women dance, sing, they sing songs, and they dance with their male counterpart at the weddings, and the festivals, and the ceremonies. So the things that the new Afghanistan that you see today, it's not that it has always been like this. These are the comments.
Ambassador, can I say something if you don't mind?
Okay, go ahead before I come to Ambassador.
Just one. Yeah, I think that's fascinating. Something I also didn't know is the difference between the South and the East, and the approach to girls' education. Indeed, I think under Mullah Omar, they left the East a little bit on its own. There was not a lot of connections with the leaders in the East. And for that, there were thousands of girls going to school under the Taliban in the 90s, right? And how is that now, if you don't mind me asking? Is there more activity?
Well, if you see, geographically, Afghanistan, based on regions, the cultures are little bit different. So, and also because of the overall aid money, the intervention that took place, that was not so equally distributed to all parts of the country, right? For example, in 20 years of the US intervention, there was always kind of a controversies that why Taliban have more support in South and Southeast and not in the North, right? So that was a very simplified way to look at it. But the thing is that lots of aid money went to the north of Afghanistan. Of course, north of Afghanistan also flourished from the aid money. And not only in the time of 20 years of intervention, but also historically, if you see Afghanistan never had a strong centralized government. So South and Southeast were usually the provinces that were lacking resources, right? And also the cultural that is there, the tribal lifestyle was such that they were kind of autonomous people. They kind of run their own life, right? And never the government security was provided to them. Education facilities was not so much provided to them. For example, in 2004 and 2003, when my father was running for the, he was a representative in the lower Jirga in 2003 to pass the new constitution. On that time, there were few NGOs that were providing, school and education to the Southeast. But after 2005, that also stopped because the, Taliban really grew in strength. So even geographically, South and Southeast, they are in border with Pakistan. So that they are more vulnerable to the, militant activity in that region, more than to the north of Afghanistan. And even there is a differences between South and Southeast. Kandahar, the heartland of, Taliban, though it's a bigger city, it's mostly, much more placed than for example, Paktika province. But, this complexity has been very different there. And tribally, for example, how security was provided to people in the South and Southeast.
Yeah.
Like, for example, there were militias, and those militias would give them security. But because slowly after 2005 and 6 and 7, Taliban grew in strength, and then mostly government activities stopped in the southeast provinces, and even the aid did not really go there, and that's how, because people didn't have any other access to the government facilities, but they had no other options just to rely on Taliban. Because if a Taliban is coming and putting a gun on your head that either you support me or I will kill you, of course you will support them, right? But for me, the fundamental, no one is fundamentally against their girls' education, right? Unless the opportunities are there. If you see, there have been many even reports even now that in Kandahar and many other provinces in southeast also, even old fathers, they are willing to kind of to take their daughters to school by bicycles, but if the opportunities are there, right? So the complexity is very much different in different regions of Afghanistan, if I have answered correctly.
Padya, before you came, I was introducing you, and I said, I don't know whether by design or by default, you've served in Syria, you've served in Afghanistan, and you've served in Myanmar. I don't know what you make of it. Whichever country you've gone and served in is a hotspot. So I don't know whether you are to blame for it or you are a victim of it. But today we won't talk about Syria, we'll talk about Afghanistan. But look, even if I was to look at Syria and I was to look at Afghanistan and I was to look at the government of India's policy and the policy of many governments around the world, do you think we are normalizing phenomena like the Taliban or the HTS? Because, okay, the Taliban is the OG, right? But now you have the HTS emerging. And in many parts of Africa, you are seeing new such groups emerge. And it seems that the world is pretty blasé about these kind of movements. They seem to have adjusted to them. Is that what's happening in your assessment?
So good afternoon, everyone. And really it's a pleasure to be here with all of you, Betty Dam, who I've met in my tenure in Afghanistan, Sarah Vahedi,
nice.
and Sushant Serene. And really, I'm sorry I came a bit late to the discussion, and I must say it's been really sort of filled with great sort of observations and great insights. And really, I would like to thank you all for it. You've asked me quite a big question. And I'd say that, in a way, one has to talk about the state of the world, a state of the world where the rest of the world, including the Western world, could not really care about gender apartheid, of the virtual erasure of women in one country. Where at one time, of course, we used to blame the West for being missionary about human rights and democracy. But today, that same West has actually virtually abandoned democracy, human rights, women's rights, anywhere outside their own small universe of the white Western world. So I think the dominating creed of international relations today is selfishness. My country first. All that I care about is America first, Europe first, India first. The entire foundation around which the United Nations, around the idea of an interdependent world, around the ideas of mutual benefit, enlightened, self-interest, has all shrunken down to a very narrow definition of national interest. And even in that national interest, it's not so much humanitarian or human interests. It is now narrowed down to a particular brand of security, and usually that security itself is defined in extremely selfish terms. So if we see the phenomenon that we are talking about, Taliban and HTS, I think one big difference that, I don't say this as answers as much as questions, and it's a question posed to all of us, is there a change? Just as we had one time international communism, communist and international, communism in one country or communism in the world. And with global jihadi Islamism, you had the whole idea of Islam in the world or Islam in my country. And I think the decision that has been made with organizations like the Taliban and the HTS is that really let us focus on so-called our version of Islam in my country and leave aside the rest of the world for the time being. And so long that is the creed, I think the rest of the world finds it possible to live with it, because whatever is happening that would be unacceptable for me or in my country, it's fine in your country. You are responsible for it. And I think that is what is providing the cushion for this kind of tolerance of, in many cases, injustice. There always will be the question whether, this kind of regime in one country is a stepping stone for a future in which it will be spread around the world. But right now, I think the world prefers to believe that, it can be contained in Syria, it can be contained in Afghanistan, and it may not spread beyond that. So yes, I think today we are in a world in which what happens elsewhere matters less. And we are in a much more selfish world. In effect, it's a kind of Hobbesian world where we are not thinking in terms of mutual interest, but in terms of pure selfish interests. And where this will go, I think the next few years will tell us whether this principle will work better. And I just don't see it working better in any way.
Ask you a follow-up on this. The government of India, in fact, India was one of the few countries which for many, many years, when every Western country was falling over itself to try and open a line of communication with the Taliban, India was resisting for the longest until the inevitability of the Taliban became very apparent. Since then, some would say we've been pragmatic. Others would say we've been opportunistic. But we've decided that we're going to engage the Taliban at whatever level. It's not a very... we are upgrading our engagement. And as far as what one learns from talking to people in India, it seems that at least insofar as India is concerned, the Taliban are living up to their commitments of not allowing any anti-India activity to take place from inside, from Afghan soil. But I think if we look at the longer term, the kind of linkages that the Taliban have with some of the international jihadist groups and some regional jihadist groups, would you think that this can be sustained for a long term, or do you think this is just a temporary kind of assurance that the Taliban have given and we need to be prepared for much worse going forward?
So I think the choices that we make are also a function of the options that we have. Between 91 and 96, we had a Taliban, if you ask me, compared to the Taliban of today, a very much more backward, a very much more rustic, a very much more provincial Taliban. I think in the 20 years of its safe havens in Pakistan, they have learned a trick or two, and a lot of it has been learned from the Pakistanis directly, right? But at that time, there was also a resistance. There was, the Northern Alliance. There was a leader like Ahmed Shah Massoud. There were many other leaders, regional leaders, Dostam, and several others, Hazara leaders, Uzbek leaders, Tajik leaders. So there were options available to the rest of the world. And then you had countries willing to exercise an option for resistance, whether it was in the self-interest or whether it was in a larger interest. Russia, Iran, India, in different ways did support. The United States at that time, by the way, had lost complete interest in Afghanistan and was perfectly happy to let it be handled by Pakistan. So I think one of the problems that we have here, and this connects me back to a little bit of the discussion on the resistance, is one of the things that the Taliban learned and executed in the very first 2 to 3 months was simply to eliminate all possibility of resistance. One of the first things that they did was take over all arms, all vehicles, just about everything that could have provided the ammunition for the resistance. Those few who actually tried to do something, let's say Amrullah Saleh left the capital, went to Panjshir, tried to organize some resistance there. None of this worked because of the sheer sort of lessons learned from the past. That's also the reason why they began from the borders. First control the borders and then take over. Also work through propaganda, psychological operations inside the Afghan National Army. So, it was a massive and extraordinary project that frankly has not been studied enough. Today, without that resistance, what are the options that countries have? Whether it's India or anyone else. And I think you made a very good point about the difference between pragmatism and opportunism. It's a spectrum between idealism, moralism, pragmatism, realism, whatever realism may be, because we can debate that, and opportunism. And certainly opportunism cannot be any policy. But I think in the case of Afghanistan, the government of India has followed a cautious and pragmatic policy. What is wrong with this pragmatic policy is that, and again, I say this as a question, are we taking Taliban to be Afghanistan? Is there an Afghanistan beyond Taliban? Do we have a policy for Afghanistan beyond the Taliban for Afghanistan? What would be the shape of that policy? Whether it would not be a much more people-to-people oriented policy, maybe even trade, maybe much more scholarships, maybe easier visa facilities, taking into account security considerations. So there is an entire spectrum of choices that are available for you. And so I would say in the context that we have, we've taken a limited view that it is just better to be with on the right side of the government, which is the way we have been dealing with, political challenges almost anywhere in the world. We have been dealing with the junta in Myanmar. So, we have not let political considerations really dictate or dominate our relationships with our neighborhood. For a long time, we dealt with the military regime in Pakistan. We've dealt with the communists in China. I don't think our values projected outwards have played much of a role in our foreign policy for a very long time after the initial flush of our post-colonial movement. So I would say that within those parameters, we have handled our relationship with the Taliban quite smartly. We haven't given them the de jure recognition that they have been seeking. We have, at the same time, while actually cutting off our people-to-people relations, we have tried to help people in Afghanistan through our humanitarian aid, through our medical aid. It's been a hands-off kind of assistance. Personally, I would like to see a much warmer and closer assistance, but I would say it's better than nothing. And in Afghanistan, this relationship is still valued. So I would say that we have handled it pragmatically. It's not as far as I would like to see it go. But, if we are 3 years or 3 to 4 years since it's happened. And one more point, almost every successful intervention, firstly, it requires an internal resistance about which we have talked about, but it also requires international assistance. Today, even that international assistance is not available anywhere. There is no country that is willing to provide that assistance to the resistance. So what can you expect in this situation? You have to just manage with what you have. I was always confident that if the Taliban ever came to power, they would need India, particularly to the extent that the core of the Taliban is Pashtun, and the Pashtuns have always looked at India as the center of their gravity, historically and economically, in terms of trade and commerce. So, particularly given their contradictions with Pakistan, there was no question that they would come to it. And this is very important for us because one of the things that the Pakistanis and the Chinese together were trying to do was to geoengineer Afghanistan's relationship with the world away from the plains of India towards the plateaus of Central Asia. And that was going to be a massive, massive task. It was, that the strategic depth would now have an economic content. And so this relationship, it was important to keep it alive, that Afghanistan remains anchored not just to Central Asia, but to South Asia as well, and that it remains a bridge between the two.
Throw the questions open to the floor, and we've almost run out of time. I have to ask a question. I have many more issues which I had outlined, but let me put a question to each of the 4 panelists, and I would want you to respond in just about half a minute or a minute, because then I can open it to the rest of the people around. on the terrorism front or the terrorism emanating out of Afghanistan front, there is the ISKP factor which has emerged. They haven't been very, very active inside Afghanistan. They have been active, but yeah, they can carry out an odd bomb blast and stuff like that. But there is a lot of blame game going around now. The Pakistanis claim that the Taliban are incapable of handling the ISK. The Taliban claiming that the Pakistanis are hand in glove with the ISK, or at least some sections of it, or at least at some level or the other. So it is a bit of a witch's brew. So I just want each one of you, and I'll start with you, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, just half a minute or minute to explain what the hell's happening, and I'll just go around all the four panelists, and then I'll throw it open to the
Years that we had when the Taliban took over was that the Taliban's partnerships with a lot of the regional, sectarian, as well as radical, extremist, Islamist, even nationalist movements the Taliban would become a kind of staging ground for, their returns for their 20 years of investment in the Taliban, and that the Taliban would help them expand their influence outward. One of the big surprises to me, because I was one of those who thought like that, was that that hasn't really happened. So to some extent, I think Taliban has kept its end of the bargain. Doesn't mean that it's been perfect, but that the kind of, radical ripples of extremism that we expected from Afghanistan hasn't quite happened. And I think that has something to do with what I said earlier, that Islam in our country matters more than perhaps the wider world.
They think that the international community, especially the Americans, wanted Taliban to cut ties with the terrorist groups, right? But we see that that is not happening, especially after the assassination of al-Zawahiri. It's proved that Taliban hasn't cut ties with the other terrorist groups. But and there has been lots of controversies about it. But just we have to understand that Taliban was and is an ideological group, and they are struggling or transiting through governance, right? So they also cannot abruptly, for example, cut ties with TTPs, that there is so much controversies, because TTP was a group that supported Taliban against NATO. They fought together and also gave them shelter, gave them refuge. And also TTP also kind of provide them a bargaining chip against Pakistan, because, so that's very important for Taliban also to have that chip. So that's why it's not very easy to understand, but the level of, radicalization is still going on in the country, and that is proven by the increase of the, for example, the religious madrasas, that before August 2021 there was only, for example, 1,008 madrasas, but currently in Afghanistan there are around 21,000 madrasas. So that's a point to be worried.
Sarah?
I would just echo His Honorable Ambassador and Professor Dawood on their comments. I don't really have anything to add. I would just say that Professor Dawood had mentioned that 40% of the revenue of the Taliban is going to security. And I know the security infrastructure very well, especially in Kabul and some of the larger provinces. And I would say that regardless of even if they were to use a significant amount of the revenue, the fact that they have been able to keep security to this level also just goes to show that the level of their influence and power. And I think, as you said, Sushant, with the ISKP and some of the smaller skirmishes and attacks, it just really doesn't hit a dent in terms of the security. And also, just again, I was going to say about the TTP, incredible amount of alliance and support there, and I think that's much more integral to the Taliban. And in terms of ISKP, perhaps my assumption would be that the Taliban isn't at all really close with them, but I would say that they have been able to keep security at a level that the ISKP really has not been able to kind of execute a lot of their own interests. I mean, their target has primarily been the Hazara community. And we have seen, I think, since the return of the Taliban regime, perhaps I'd say I would, off the top of my head, but I would have to verify, about 3 attacks on the Hazara community, but primarily that's their target. But I would just echo those 2 comments.
Betty Dam, can you Would you want to weigh in?
I think the idea that the United States called a sort of master narrative of terrorism on Afghanistan is based on a lot of false information. For example, the close relationship between the Taliban and Al Qaeda has been completely exaggerated and is actually false. The idea that that terrorism label has done much more harm to Afghanistan than anything good. And we see that again. On the one hand, what you see is that ISIS in Afghanistan has always been misused, that label, by President Ghani, blaming attacks on ISIS while it was internal. We have seen a terrible killing in Bamiyan also from foreigners, where the Taliban now immediately points at ISIS, which was a Taliban himself who killed these people. So we have to be careful with these labels and investigate a lot. We know that the CIA is on the ground in Kabul, that the CIA takes this terrorism threat still extremely serious and has made a deal with the Taliban to be present and to fight this group. But we still don't know how big that group is and what the real threat is. I do think and then there's the last comment I want to make, is that because of the exclusion of the movement, they are extremely hateful towards the West. At the same time, they want to be part of the United Nations, but there is a lot of distrust towards the Western community. We do see in the madrasas more and more angry men organizing themselves, trained in fighting, something that is a little bit new and that's much more related to these men who have been fighting for so long and who in a way radicalized. I don't want to use that word so often, but yeah, I think that's my answer to this.
Floor is open. Please identify yourself, identify the person you're putting a question to, and keep it short. I'll take about 5 or 6 questions in the first go. We have about 15 minutes. I'm extending this program by about 15 minutes. So please,
Thank you, sir. Am I audible? Yeah, just my question is... Yeah. My name is Muhammad. Yeah, my name is Muhammad Hanif. I'm doing PhD from JNU. So my question was about this, that the fraction that we are talking about, Taliban, and especially the Kandahari Taliban and also the Haqqani network. So how you think this fraction work and how the Trump policy which is coming to power, how it affect this fraction?
Firstly, greetings from my side. I'm Colonel Deepak Kumar. We all know that Taliban are conservative, no doubt, but we are also expecting that the Taliban 2.0, they are far more smarter. Some of them have been educated during the 20 years of exile when they were in Doha, and when they speak also, some of them are quite rational and logical. But how do they reconcile with this conflicting ideas of that women only being treated by women doctors, but at the same time not allowing any education for women? So how do they get the doctors and women medical professionals? My question is to Betty Dam, actually, because you mentioned that you have met a lot of Taliban leaders and interacted with them. Has this ever occurred to you? Have you put across this question to them? And if you could just give us an insight into into the interactions you have had with the Taliban leaders.
Hello, I'm Anushka Dhar and I'm doing my master's from Delhi University. So my question is to Sarah. Women has been affected the most due to the Afghanistan crisis. So how do you see, has there been adequate global support to the cause of women in Afghanistan? And how do you think the global community should respond to this issue?
Hello, sir. So my name is Nikhar. My question is to Mahapadhyay, sir. So since the Taliban's return to power in Kabul, tensions along the Durand Line has escalated. between the Afghanistan and Pakistan radical groups. So in the long run, could this have any impact on Indian security situations, sir? Thank you.
My name is Abu Zafar. So my question to Bette Dam. In your book, you mentioned that in Taliban in 90s, they used the girls' education as a bargaining chip, especially negotiation with recognition from UN, right? If I remember correctly. So how do you think this term banning girls' education, are they are doing the same or their mentality has changed something? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Pushpa and I am interning at ORF, working on Afghanistan. So my question can be answered by any one of the panelists. Okay, Mukhopadhyay sir or Bilkis ma'am. So when Taliban came to power, they put a ban on opium production, cultivation, and later on the marketing and etc. So now that US has cut the aid and they don't have a big source of revenue, cross-border trade is one of their biggest source of revenues. So do you see that Taliban will in near future change their stance on opium production and again, like they have done in past, will call it like production of opium is not haram, but selling it it is. So can you see that happening or not?
Good evening. My question is to Dr. Bilkis. This is more of a hypothetical question. We are discussing about the ideology of Taliban and what it is leading for women in Afghanistan. Let's say we are seeing that there is two factions within the Taliban, one which is supporting education for girls and the other which is not. Let's say the other party which is not supportive right now comes into the favor of women and they agree or allow the education of women in madrasas or special schools for women. Do you think that will lead to any kind of acceptance among the Afghans with regard to their ideology and theological understanding or interpretation that they have? It's just a hypothetical question, and what do you think about it? Thank you. And my name is Soumya.
Thank you. My name is Karimi. Sushan sir, for your information, state the cash flow, humanitarian cash flow through US is coming to Afghanistan. It has not been stopped yet, but we don't know. We don't know what next. But my question is from the two Madam Sarah and Madam Bilkis. You thought of the economy in Afghanistan, which has a lot of aspects. But what do you make out of the Taliban shortage of paying their salaries of their employees? Past 5 months, it's continuing. And we know the revenue they are connecting, the mining they are doing, they have done contract with the Chinese. You will find Chinese in every village of Afghanistan with a Pashtun Taliban commander holding a contract of gold mine or one other mine. What do you make of that one? Why Taliban, they are facing shortage of cash and they are not able to pay their staff salary and to pay their contracts they have made with the companies, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Sharif, former diplomat of Afghanistan for USA. Currently reside in India. As the lady said, narcotics is a big challenge for Afghanistan. So my question is that how do you think it will not affect the current government, the current institution in Afghanistan? Because in 2014, the GDP of Afghanistan was 10 billion. And the income from narcotics for Afghanistan at that time was 7 billion, according to UNDP survey. So I'm sure these things will happen again. And what's your idea about this concern?
My name is Pavan. My question is directed to Ambassador. Sir, you said that for any resistance, you require external support. So the problem, what happened in August 21 was that Americans, they left all their ammunitions in Afghanistan without taking them back. And it has all fallen with the Taliban. And they have systematically, in fact, managed the distribution of the, in fact, arms and ammunitions, so that it is virtually impossible that any resistance will come up. This is an important factor, which in fact probably in any analysis should be taken into or factored into. Thank you.
Go around the panel. Bette, I believe you have to go. So if you want to answer the questions that have been put to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think on the fragmentation within the movement we have talked about in the beginning of the meeting. I think we have given some clear answers on that. On the question on the like using girls' education as a tool to impact the relationship with the Americans to get attention. I think I for the Taliban right now, I thought that maybe for a while after, in the beginning of the movement, we talked about this as well. There was more openness to be seen, and after 7-8 months, it changed, and the Taliban leadership, the Emir, became more and more conservative and extreme in his decisions, and one of them is the girls' education. For a while, I thought maybe this is indeed politics, but I don't think it is. What they did is stop the opium production. That is definitely an attempt to be liked by the international community. They do still think that they deserve a seat at the United Nations. They have always thought that. That was contrary, by the way, to Osama bin Laden, his movement, who did not want to have anything to do with the West. Anyhow, so yeah, that is my my answer to the questions.
Sarah?
Thank you very much for your question on women's rights and how the global support and if it's been adequate. So I've been working on this front on a couple of things. One is I currently sit on the special counsel for the ICC on Afghanistan, and I work specifically on testimony collection. And I would say that the member states, the 4 member states, and I think now we're on the 5th one of Canada, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Germany, who have now brought forward the case to the ICJ, is an incredibly important point. And I would really hope that the Indian government think about joining these member states on holding the Taliban accountable in terms of gender persecution under CEDAW, under this very specific principle of persecution against women. Of course, that has very political connotations, but for India. But I think what's important is that more countries take a very specific stance on gender persecution, specifically under the entrenched human rights, especially education and access to healthcare. These are ones that have really impacted women, and I'm working with UN Women right now on the NGO ban of women working with NGOs. And the Taliban, actually, this was one that we were hoping we could circumvent in certain ways, but the NGO ban of women working in NGOs has been incredibly disastrous. The Taliban now is essentially going door to door to NGOs, checking if women are working. There was a recent raid on Women for Women Afghanistan, where they were trying to see if women are working. So it's definitely not adequate enough. More countries need to execute robust diplomacy in terms of holding the Taliban accountable. The ICC, the arrest warrants by Karim Khan was obviously something that many of us probably didn't think was going to happen. So these notions, these kind of international movements, specifically in terms of persecution, and again, all of the interventions that I speak on are about women's rights, and the reason for that is this is something that's something that generally universally we all agree, even within the Taliban factions, that this is something that needs to change as soon as possible. So I'd hope that NGOs, women's organizations across the world, especially governments, find strategic ways to be involved. And for those in terms of how the global community should respond, joining the member states in terms of the upcoming ICJ proceedings in June, just having the conversation ongoing in terms of this. And like we've spoken, and His Honorable Ambassador had mentioned, we have more questions that have come out from this dialogue than answers. And that is a great way to move forward, is how do we now approach finding the answers to these issues. So definitely not adequate enough, but there are strategic and very robust things that are moving forward. But I'd say that we need more countries to be involved. And now, in terms of the Indian context, which we're speaking now, it's incredibly important for Indian diplomats and leaders to figure out how could they engage in terms of holding the Taliban accountable specifically for gender persecution, and doing it in a way that is viable for India, but also, as the ambassador said, to think about, mutual support, and not to think about what's happening within my country doesn't impact yours. This impacts women across the world and sets an extremely dangerous precedent for the way that a group of men essentially can decide and dictate that women cannot go to school or can't even go to seek urgent healthcare for the fact that, on the basis of the fact that they are women. So I really hope that what's taken out of this in this great room of leaders is to figure out strategically how we can approach the situation.
Most of the comments are economy, and then one comment on education. So about the opium and narcotics, as mentioned, that this is an option for Taliban, but I don't think so they will go back to that extreme level that they used to do as Taliban 1.0, because the same thing, that if they really want the international recognition, and that will be a really drawback for them. And but as one of the our audience said, that the cash flow hasn't really stopped from the United States, so maybe informally it's still going on with the Taliban. And about the economy, it's exactly what I also said, that though in one hand economy is doing good, it's stabilizing, but on the other hand, there are lots of speculation that how Taliban are spending their government revenues, because still they're spending 40% on security, and there are no reports that why the salaries have been cut and why they're still not able to provide salaries for their employees, right? And the other thing is about the kind of education. That's a very good question, and if we are optimistic, and exactly that is also the fear that I have, that whenever we talked about women's education, we always forget that even if they are provided education, which kind of education? That's a very important question, because recently Taliban have established a group of a member committee who are working on the curriculum. So they are really changing the education curriculum in the country, and that's not really new for Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, every regime change was with the change in education curriculum, and education plays a very vital role. So that is the kind of concern that we are having. Which kind of education? And education is a very important factor in bringing radical ideology, brainwashing Afghans, like it happened during the jihad period in the refugee camps, that the same, maybe some of members of Taliban were part of those education system, that, for example, the kind of books that were being taught in the refugee camps were like, if you have 4 Russian soldiers, if you kill 2 of them, how many are left? This was the way that they were teaching maths to Afghan students. So that radicalization is still going on. And also the fact that Taliban have inaugurated a suicide museum, where they are kind of, there are also the equipment that they have used in the suicide bombing. So it means the idea of radicalization through education and through all other awareness programs are still going on. And that should be a point of concern for the international community and for Afghans as well. Thank you.
Last word.
Points before I come to the specific questions addressed to me. One is, I think, the point that you posed and Bilkis ji just replied, really, really important. Even in Syria, just to go back, one of the ways in which radical ideologies were kept alive was, especially during the period of the Muslim Brotherhood and Senior Assad, was really through women. And, behind the curtain, through radicalized education, and especially if it's directed through women, it's a form of incubation of an ideology which will take shape over a long period of time. And therefore, while we may not be seeing things right away, there are things that you are likely to see. I mean, Afghanistan is probably the only country in the world, the army actually has suicide brigades. And the suicide brigades are decorated and celebrated, for being, somehow in conformity with a certain value system. The question on the Durand line, look, one of the things that I think we are all agreed on is that everything is connected and things are going to have an impact. In many ways, I'm speculating here a little, just to, as a kind of thought exercise. In some ways, Afghanistan has always been a staging ground for rivalries coming in from Central Asia, from Persia, and from what you can call Eastern Afghanistan today, the plains of Pakistan, which is the area that's straddling the Pashtun tribes and so on. So in many ways, there has been a kind of competition for power between these three rival centers. And Kabul has been the place that has kind of held it all together. So imagine if the Durand line were to be changed. We as a government, we don't pronounce on the Durand line at all because, this opens whole issues about borders and inherited borders and colonial borders and so on that, men are too potent to raise. But just imagine that if, as the Taliban believe, that the Durand line is not a line that they recognize. And I think most Pashtuns also believe that they are, one set of tribes on both sides of an artificial line. Then obviously this is going to have a political, a regional political impact that is going to have an impact on the other ethnicities and the traditional rivalries that we've always seen. And that may not be direct, but eventually combined with radicalism, it would have an impact in the entire region, including India, but not in the short term. And obviously, this is a little bit of a hypothetical scenario, but I think that's my answer. To your questions on the US arms, yes, quite natural. I said that, in fact, the entire Taliban elimination of resistance is founded on, the confiscation and monopoly of arms and of power and of force. And that is how it is preventing even the smallest of resistance groups. In fact, they have managed to pretty much neutralize most of them. There are a few, acts of resistance rather than a movement that we can call it. Obviously, the spirit of resistance exists, and the spirit of resistance will surface when the opportunity surfaces for people to feel that they can make a difference. Right now, people simply don't feel they can make a difference. And I agree with Sarah, and I think she made some brilliant points about, how resistance itself is just the ability to survive, to live. And that resistance may come from civil forms, not necessarily arms and military forms, and that they may come from issues of justice, like, gender rights or women's rights in particular, and education in particular. So I think in many ways, people who may wish to work on more progressive values for Afghanistan will need to continue to plow and furrow this field for it to, just as the radicals may wish to concentrate on education in the madrasas, and even girls' education would be bent in that direction, the rest of the world should be working in the opposite direction. Thank you.
Ambassador Saab, Professor Bilkis, Sarah, and of course Betty Dam. I think you guys made some fabulous points, including Sarah about what we got our independence, or at least that's the story. Passive resistance. Just the sheer act of defiance is resistance. Yes, so Sarah's given some very good examples of that. Thank you so much, all of you, for participating in this. And thanks a lot to the audience for sitting for what is almost 2 hours now. I think we could have gone on for longer. I had so many more questions to ask everybody. But thanks a lot, everybody. Thank you so much, Sarah. We hope to have you over soon again. Thanks a lot.